Okay. Hello, Goose. All right. So sound check. Hopefully this will work. Okay. So I guess Goose is the only person watching at this point. Uh, is the audio okay? All right. I got rid of the echo. I got rid of the echo. There should be no echo now. I have purged the echo from the broadcast. Okay. So this is not the best organized because looking through my notes, I noticed that like a lot of military history, and uh, at the base, that's what this is. Although I'm a political historian, so I tend to take a broader, uh, more holistic view of these things than just what is happening on the battlefield. But obviously, uh, the Ostlegionen and the Waffen SS, both military units within the German military structure. So the SS is kind of a parallel military established originally as Hitler's bodyguard under Heinrich Himmler. It creates kind of a giant foreign legion starting in 1943. But even earlier, the normal German armed forces, the Wehrmacht, and here we're talking mostly the Heer, which is the army, as opposed to the Luftwaffe or Kriegsmarine, uh, began the recruitment of non-Germans, particularly from Soviet POWs, and they are quite diverse, as is the Soviet population and Soviet Red Army itself. So since they're being recruited out of POW camps, out of the 1.3 million Soviet citizens that fight with the German military during the Second World War, about a million are Eastern Slavs, Russians, lots of Ukrainians, and Belarusians. And about 300,000 are not Slavic. And so these are almost all from POWs that are recruited rather than people on the ground, since for the most part, the Germans did not occupy non-Slavic areas of the Soviet Union. There's some exceptions in the North Caucasus, but they never get to Central Asia. They just barely get to Chechnya. They don't cross the Caucasus in any substantial way into Georgia. And yet, of course, there is a Georgian Legion, Armenian Legion, in the Wehrmacht, Ostlegions, but also a number of Muslim ones, including, of course, across the Caucasus, the Azerbaijanis, and then on the northern side, quite a few Dagestanis. Uh, those are both areas bordering the Caspian Sea, which the Wehrmacht never got to. So the German military, of course, particularly on the Eastern Front, and particularly after Stalingrad, is desperate for more men. So they do conscript a large numbers of these non-Germans, organize them, particularly, they said, from prisoner of war camps. So I'm going to go look at the notes here. But all right, so among those recruited are okay. So there's some out of 90 battalions from mostly the Caucasus and Central Asia for non-Slavic Soviet citizens. and these include large number of Azerbaijanis, a fairly large number of North Caucasians, Kalmucks, Crimean Tatars, Armenians, Georgians, Volga Tatars, as well as Central Asians. So many of these areas are not occupied by the Germans, so they are solely recruited from the prisoner of war camps. All right. And for these groups, particularly early on, 1941, 1942, as I said, mostly all under the Wehrmacht, the Heer, and not the Waffen SS. So the Waffen SS will not take any non-German, though it takes Volksdeutsche outside of the Reich earlier until 1943, and when we have the formation of the Handschar division in Bosnia, which is a Muslim division. And this kind of get into why I want to do this, because I'm still fascinated by the case of Muhammad Abdul Rahman Barker and why so many of his long-term fans were shocked that he was sympathetic to National Socialism but had converted to Islam in 1951 and married a Pakistani woman. The National Socialists were never anti-Muslim. They certainly recruited Muslims into their military, including the Waffen SS, which had the Handschar division, when the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem helped recruit Bosnians into that unit to fight against Tito's partisans. Bosnia was under the NDH, the independent state of Croatia, under Ante Pavelic, who Pavelic was known as the Poglavnik, or head, but the NDH was explicitly in its constitution created as a state that was bi-religious, both Roman Catholic and Sunni Islam, to include the Bosnian Muslim. It excluded Eastern Orthodox Serbs and Jews, but there was no, as I guess the proper politically correct term today would be Islamophobia among the European Axis powers. So Germany and Croatia had explicitly Muslim military units that fought on the Eastern Front and in the Balkans and even in the Western Front later in the war. And this was never considered a problem. There wasn't an Islamic question that needed a solution the way there was a Jewish question in National Socialist Germany or the NDH. Jared is partially about the Handschar division. I've mentioned them and the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem recruiting soldiers to fight in Bosnia against the partisans under Tito. All right. So historically, obviously, there isn't any conflict between National Socialism and Islam the way there is between Jewishness and National Socialism. All right. So why they would think that his religious beliefs as a Sunni Muslim or his marriage into a Muslim family in South Asia would prevent him from viewing this regime sympathetically is kind of a mystery to me. I mean, I don't go into the idea that Muslims are modern day National Socialists, but the German government certainly had a number of Muslims divisions, particularly from the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, fighting on its side against particularly communist partisans. A lot of this was anti-partisan units. So this was particularly the case in Yugoslavia, Bosnia against Tito's partisans. So we have the Handschar division. And then later from that, there's an Albanian division, Skanderbeg, that's particularly active in Kosovo. All right. And we have a Turkestan Legion, which is under the Wehrmacht, which is Kazakhs, mostly Uzbeks, Karakalpaks, Turkmen. For some reason, Turkestan seems to include the Tajiks, who are not Turkic, they're Persian. And the Turkestan Legion, organized in the Wehrmacht, was not an exception. A large Azerbaijani legion, fairly large. All told, if we look at the number of non-Slavs from the Soviet Union, not including the Baltic states, about 300,000. So if we subtract the Christian legions, which are Georgian and Armenian, we got about 250,000 Soviet Muslims, very varied from the west in the Crimean Peninsula, various Crimean Tatars, Schutzmannschaft battalion, perhaps as many as 10,000 Crimean Tatars. All the way to the east, as I said, the people from Kyrgyzstan who had been either conscripted or voluntarily joined the Soviet Red Army and then were captured by the Germans and then volunteered for the Turkestan Legion as a way of getting out of the POW camps. And as a general rule, this as a personal decision, this is a smart move. The conditions in the Wehrmacht for the Ostlegionen were much better in terms of rations and supplies than were provided in the prisoner of war camps for former Red Army soldiers. Perry, I don't think it can. It doesn't have a very large population, and the Uzbeks have lots of people, but this is I'm a historian, so I can't tell you what's going to happen with Karakalpakstan. But there were Karakalpakistanis, the ethnic group. It literally means somebody, the black hat, Kara black, and Kalpak is a type of hat. They're between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, the northern part of Uzbekistan today. There were members of that nationalnost that fought in the Turkestan Legion. So as part of this, there were about 16,000 Central Asians that fought in the Turkestan Legion. So less than, of course, the closer groups like the Azerbaijanis and Dagestanis who never came under German rule but were coming close. The Germans got to the edge of Chechnya, so they actually occupied Ingushetia, one of the Vainak people's homeland during the war, and the territories of most of the Circassians, particularly the Cherkess and Karbards, as well as some of the Turkic peoples, the Karachay and the Balkars, were under German military administration of the Wehrmacht for a period of time during the Second World War. So there could be direct recruitment without having to go through the POW camp. But the POW camps also had another advantage in that these people had already had military training of some sort by the Soviets. So they basically knew how to handle a gun and hopefully follow orders in military fashion. Although a lot of the initial Soviet resistance to the German invasion in 1941 was not very well organized, although a lot of it was also very heroic. So, I mean, I don't want to dismiss the efforts by the peoples of the Soviet Union, but Stalin's purging of the Red Army Officer Corps in 37 and 38 left it with far fewer brains than it needed to successfully stop the Germans during the summer of 41. So it's only in December 41, when they're already out the gates of Moscow, that the Soviet Red Army is able to stop the German advance. So, now interestingly enough, while almost every Soviet nationality, including even the small Karaite Jews in Crimea, had some military service with the Germans. The Karaites were classified as being racially Turkic, descended of the Khazars, Khazar Khanate, and only Jewish by religion, and so were spared being shot by the Einsatzgruppen. Only certain groups were punished for it. So the Karachais and the Balkars and the Crimean Tatars, the Kalmucks, who are not Muslim but Buddhist, they had a Kalmuk cavalry corps of some 5,000 Kalmucks under the command of Otmar Verba. Verba was a Sudeten German who, after World War I, when the Sudetenland comes under Czech rule, moved to Germany, and he was a scholar of Mongolian languages and culture. There were not that many people, obviously, in Germany who spoke Mongol, but Kalmuk is a Western Mongol language. It's an Oryat language from the Jungarians. So when the German Wehrmacht crossed over the river into what was the Kalmuk Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic and saw these Mongol peoples, they called him and they gave him a commission in the Abwehr, and he thought he was the next Lawrence of Arabia. He was going to be the Indiana Jones, I guess, the Bavaria Johannes of of World War II. He has this according to Hoffman. Hoffman's not the most reliable, but it was for a long time one of the few sources we had on the Ostlegionen. And he, of course, obviously German military. But he said that Otmar Verba, who took the name Dr. Dole, Dr. Pretty, so he went by the name Dr. Otto Dole, went to the Kalmucks and showed his swastika, the Hakenkreuz, which is a holy symbol in Buddhism, which is the religion of the Kalmucks, and said, "Look, I too share the same symbol, and I will rescue you from the godless atheist communist." So he was a bit of a, what's the word, egomaniac. He had a much fuller sense of himself than he probably deserved. I mean, I guess for somebody who was primarily an academic and hadn't been involved in the military since the First World War, he did okay leading the cavalry unit of Kalmucks, but as anti-partisan warfare. But you would think part of being a responsible military leader is some humility, and not to let your head get bigger than the sun. At any rate, the Kalmucks were also one of the Eastern Legions, the Kalmuk Cavalry Corps, devoted to fighting against NKVD partisans. And they, along with the Crimean Tatars, the Karachais, the Balkars, Chechens, the English, were accused of wholesale collaboration with the German occupation and forcibly deported into, for the Kalmucks, it was Siberia, mostly Novosibirsk Oblast, Altai Krai, Omsk Oblast, and then in the east of Siberia, Krasnoyarsk Krai. For the other groups, it's mostly Central Asia, particularly Kazakhstan, but for the Crimean Tatars, Uzbekistan. Now, this is kind of no rhyme or reason. Out of 100,000 Kalmucks, there were 5,000 in the Kalmuk Cavalry Corps. Out of 200,000 Crimean Tatars, there were 10,000 Crimean Tatars in Schutzmannschaft Battalion. But there were a lot more Dagestanis and Azerbaijanis, and of course, the largest group, some 1 million, were Eastern Slavs, Russians, Ukrainians, the Belarusians. There were 2 Russian Waffen SS divisions officially, as well as the 14th Galician SS division was Ukrainian from Western Ukraine. It was destroyed during the war, but many of its members later made their way to fight with UPA under the UNBE against the Soviets after the end of the Second World War. I don't think GIEP is underrated. I've never heard anybody say that GIEP was anything but one of the greatest military generals ever, certainly of the 20th century. Maybe it's because I'm a bit older than you, and when I was around, we were still talking about Vietnam rather than World War II. But GIEP certainly, even in the 80s, was very highly ranked as a specialist in guerrilla warfare. His defeat of the French at Dien Bien Phu called up as a model for victorious asymmetrical warfare, anti-colonial struggles. I don't think GIEP is, well, maybe later he became underrated, but certainly during the time when he was commanding the PAVN, People's Army of Vietnam, against the U.S., and in the 2 decades after that, I don't think he was underrated. I think he finally died. He was in his hundreds. Very impressive, though, and certainly I would say that his book, which was translated into English during the Vietnam War, obviously, for what the American military could study it. Not that it helped us win, but it was at least something in the right direction. Is well worth reading. So back to the Second World War, which is what we obsess with now, because supposedly it's a great struggle between pure good and pure evil, but I don't think that's really the way it was shaking out. And I think this idea that the Germans were hateful and the enemy of all brown, black, and Islamic peoples in the world is obviously false, although it's kind of a modern retrospective you hear. I mean, honestly, there are legitimate reasons why many of the people in the Soviet Union that were not white wanted to fight with the Germans. There was at the time a massive uprising under Hassan Israelov. Begins before the German invasion in 1940. It continues until 1944 among the Chechens. The final solution, of course, being the mass deportation of the Chechens on 23rd to 29th February 44 into Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, where about a third of them died by 1949. But we look at also people that were living under French or British rule. There's an Arab legion recruited in North Africa. Uh, there is an Indian National Army, the Azad Hind, under Bose, who was a major political figure in India. He headed the Indian National Congress right before he ended up fleeing to Germany to avoid arrest. And he's still a major political figure as far as the evolution of the independence movement in India is concerned. We have lots of people that had good reason to think that Churchill and de Gaulle and Stalin were greater evils and more oppressive than Hitler. And most of those people, not surprisingly given geography, are non-white. They are people in Asia and Africa. Which again, right, this isn't rocket science. This is something it's pretty easy to figure out. But I'm still kind of like shocked by the kind of complete unawareness of people when Barker died. You know, how could he be sympathetic to National Socialism because he was a Muslim and married to a brown woman? The German National Socialists were not killing brown and black people. They were killing Jews and white communists and Slavs who were also white-skinned. No, this is a cheap shirt I bought in the Suleimania Bazaar. It's whatever. I don't know if it's Chinese or Turkish or what. Probably Turkish. I haven't looked at the label. So we have the very diverse German military because obviously compared to the Soviet Union and the United States, they didn't, or even the British Empire, which had India and Africa, they didn't have the manpower, and they had lost a lot of men. In total, some 5 million military losses for Germany. So it's considerable. So they ended up having to recruit lots of people that were not Germanic, including, as I said, lots of Eastern Slavs, over 1 million Russians and Ukrainians and Belarusians. But perhaps as many as 300,000, 350,000 maybe Muslims from the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, Albania, North Africa. You mean the INC, not the ANC. ANC is in South Africa, the Indian National Congress, but yeah. Well, I mean, it's complicated like everything else, but obviously Bose was an Indian nationalist who put independence of India from the British as his first priority. And if that meant cooperating with the Germans and Japanese, who were not the ones who had colonized India, then so be it. All right, it's not a huge moral issue for Bose and his followers about this. And in fact, given what happened in the Bengal region during the war, there's even more added reason to oppose the British as opposed to regard and to get support from wherever you can, including from the Axis. All right, so uh, there's all this justification historic of World War II for why it was okay to ally with Stalin, a man who was murdering millions of people, including very large numbers of Asian people who were not white, Kalmucks deported in 43 to Siberia, some 20% of them perishing as a result. But nobody ever says that it's okay for oppressed or colonized people to ally with the Germans. But I don't see why one would apply and the other would not. Oh, wow. I did not know that YouTube had gotten rid of the timestamps. Well, the fan, even with the fan, it's over 90 something degrees here because I'm not making enough money in my current job to afford air conditioning. Um, uh, and so, kind of a larger picture here I wanted to look at. So one thing we can see is that this idea that there's going to be total equality among people of all nationality and races and other divisions in the Soviet Union totally failed. A lot of people that joined with the Germans in these military units did so for specifically national reasons. That is, they believed that their nationality was being repressed. So we can look at the Kalmucks and the suppression of the Buddhist religion. We look at the North Caucasians and the shutting down of mosques. We can look at the collectivization of agriculture and destruction of traditional pastoralist economies in the Kalmuk steppe, Kazakhstan, and the North Caucasus. So the well, uh, these units and the recruitment, I mean, did appeal. So I mean, sometimes it's over the top, like Dr. Dole, to use his preferred pseudonym rather than a verb, but. But in most cases, is a bit more rational. All right. Particularly, we look at the policy of the Wehrmacht, which was more pragmatic than the National Socialist administration under the Gauleiters. So Belarus in the Ukraine, or at least the western and central parts of Ukraine, are put under the Gauleiters. Erich Koch, in particular, is the Gauleiter for most of Ukraine. He's particularly ideological views on racial inferiority of Ukrainians. The Wehrmacht, when it military occupies the North Caucasus, is more pragmatic. And so one of the things it does that the Koch does not in Ukraine is it decollectivizes agriculture, gets rid of the collective farm, allows the traditional economy to be restored. They also allow the reopening of the mosques, the mechet, and the return of traditional Islamic religious life. So this is all things that bring them in favor to the local population in the North Caucasus. Why you have things like the Karachay National Committee supporting the Germans against the Soviets. My chat has gotten completely sidetracked, now talking about things I don't understand. So I will ignore it until it returns to things that I can understand. And again, this was understood during the Cold War for a long time, and particularly the large number of Latvians who fought in the two Waffen SS divisions, the Latvian Legion. They were all given a free pass by the Americans and British, as was the Estonians, much smaller number fighting in one Estonian Legion under the Waffen SS. But the rest of the Waffen SS units were declared to be criminal organizations, regardless of what they had done as their own actions. But the logic in the Baltic states being independent, then invaded and occupied and oppressed by the Soviets, with the exception of having independent states, this applies to many of the non-Russian groups that provided military units that fought under the Germans. Now, it also, in some sense, could also apply to the ethnic Russians who fought with the Germans. As I said, there were two Russian Waffen SS units that fought for the Germans against the Soviets. But it's a harder stretch to make, obviously, since while the Soviet leadership was definitely multinational, Stalin was Georgian, Beria was Georgian, Kaganovich was Jewish, Mikoyan was Armenian, Khrushchev was Ukrainian. The bulk of the Communist Party apparatus, the majority, as well as the majority of the population of the Soviet Union itself, were ethnically Russian. So there certainly was, after 1938, a movement to consolidate the Soviet Union around the Russian core, since it just wasn't possible to continue with the extreme, I don't know what you would call it, but there's a movement from bio-Leninism to bio-Stalinism, let's just put it that way. All right. But nonetheless, there are plenty of Russians that are not very happy with the Soviet government under Stalin, although generally not for national reasons, like, say, the North Caucasians or Ukrainians or Kalmucks, or certainly the Baltic states, who had the least number of years under Soviet rule, only really about one by the time the Germans come in 1941. All right. Oh, and this also, I think, ties in. I've already mentioned my earlier Barker presentation, which kind of eventually I want to do something serious as far as like maybe a actual real journal article on these connections with the Barker and Orientalism and National Socialism and fantasy literature, but it's hard to do any real research without access to libraries and probably archives. I'm not sure exactly where I'd get all the archives for that. But also ties into Nolte, Ernst Nolte. So the idea of the Soviet Union as an Asiatic power, headed by Stalin from Georgia, and Beria also from Georgia, but also we see here a lot of the Red Army, Asians from Central Asia, and then they are recruited in an Asiatic method by the Germans to fight against the Soviet Union. So this kind of idea of the USSR as a Asiatic despotism, both in its internal structure, but also Asiatic threat from the East to Europe, and the need to take Asiatic extreme measures to counter it, all kind of fall in here. The things that Nolte was talking about, more specifically with regard to specific German atrocities, which I don't want to mention here because I don't want to get stupid warning stamped by YouTube, but I think it applies also here to the fact that many of the people fighting on both sides, as I said, it's certainly in the hundreds of thousands for the German side, and it's probably in the millions for the Soviet side, were literally Asian, mostly Muslim, but some like the Kalmucks and the Buryats, Buddhist. All right. Oh, I've gone on now for almost 45 minutes. So I'm going to kind of conclude, and then I'll invite some guests on if anybody wants to discuss this or anything else. But the first thing, it would be definitely as far as this German conception of race, there was very little in terms of imposing second-class citizenship or eliminating people of African or Asian ancestry. The small African population within Germany, mostly mixed race, had a very mixed fate, but they didn't all go to camps. They were not targeted for extermination the way Jews and Gypsies were. A number of them did quite well during the war as propaganda actors in anti-colonial movies made by the Germans. Again, the German attitude towards Islam, quite favorable. Definitely see this with the creation of the Handschar division in Bosnia and the invitation to the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem to come to Bosnia, which he does to help recruit for the unit, which is dedicated mostly to fighting against Tito's communist partisans. We also see a large number of people who would be considered brown or yellow, also fighting in various German military units, Arabs, Indians, Kalmucks, Crimean Tatars, Dagestanis, Azerbaijanis, Circassians. These people, most of them Muslim, although the Kalmucks are Buddhist. But there isn't this kind of superiority that you see with the British in particular, but also the French in their colonial empires. And the British, extended their control over the Muslim world during the Second World War. So Iraq had been given independence in 1932, but because the Iraqi government in 1941 saw that its largest trade partner, Germany, and also Italy and Vichy France, were the people that would best support its economic interest, the British invaded Iraq and occupied it and ended its independence in 1941. And there is a pogrom in Baghdad that kills a small number, I think about 120, I have to look up the number, of Jews who were suspected of collaborating with the British reoccupying and reconquering Iraq. They also invade with the Soviet Union, Iran, which had been an independent state under Shah Mohammad Pahlavi I. The British come in from the south and the Soviets from the north, and partition Iran during the years 1941 to 1945. The Shah Mohammad Pahlavi is exiled to South Africa, where he dies, and his son, who was the Shah that is overthrown in 79, who is very young, is put on the throne, but he has no power. Power in the south is totally controlled by the British military, and power in the north by the USSR. So there is a de facto occupation of Iran as well, which doesn't make the Persians very pro-British either. All right, so one can understand why, if you were an Arab, particularly from Mesopotamia, or a Persian, why Churchill would not be like your favorite go-to guy. Maybe Mussolini or Hitler would cut you a better deal. And the Germans had a pretty good reputation in the Middle East. Kaiser Wilhelm had toured the Ottoman Empire. There are plaques, I've seen them in both Lebanon and Turkey. There's a monument in Istanbul I saw 2021, so last year, in summer when I was there, when it's his visit. And when I went to Lebanon in 2004, I saw the plaque in Beirut. I'm told there's also in Haifa, but I never got there. But the thing is, the Germans were unlike the British and French, who were trying to carve up the Ottoman Empire, which they did after World War I, and put the various Arab provinces under their control, which they did. And in Iraq, they did it twice, right? Independence in 32, then just a mere 9 years later, in 41, they're occupied again by the British. Right? So the British not making themselves well loved in Iraq or Iran or India, which at that time included what later will become Pakistan and Bangladesh. The famine of 43 is in the Bengal area, but also Boza is from the Bengal area. So the initial start of geographically British colonialism in South Asia is also comes back in the Second World War as, in some sense, to haunt them, since Boza is from that region. All right, I'm gonna give if anybody wants to come on, you can email me, or you can send me a DM, and I'll send you the link. So my Twitter first. It was what most people used to like to use. I'm old-fashioned. I like to use email, but it doesn't matter to me too much. All right, so this has been kind of rambling. Yes, that's my understanding. Yeah, that the Azad Hind Fouaj was mostly out of Bengal, and that was in large part because Boza and his network were Bengali. But it could also be a greater trend. A lot of the intellectual movements in the subcontinent have come from the Bengal region, so including the Maoist. I sent you that. I said that poster. He's also our chairman, right? The Soviets left Iran under pressure from Truman, but they tried to keep the Azeri part. They created the Azerbaijani Democratic Republic, and also the Kurdish part. They created what was known as the Mahabad Republic, but it called itself Kurdish Republic. So these were two Soviet satellite states that they were trying to maintain among non-Persian minorities in northwestern Iran. But the United States gave a lot of armaments and training to the Iranians after the British left southern Iran. And so the newly revamped Iranian army was able to crush the separatists, both among the Azeris and the Kurds. But the first Shah Pahlavi, the one that was in power up until 1941, was quite pro-German because Germany was Iran's largest trade partner. And in fact, the name Iran was taken in 1936, meaning land of Aryans, to try and stress kind of a greater connection with the Germans than the name Persia had. Although, interestingly enough, because Kurds and Balukis and some of the other non-Persian minorities in Iran are Aryan as well. Aryan is a more inclusive term, a more equitable term, a more equality, inclusiveness. What is that other thing we needed? I forget. But anyways, it's it's more liberal in the Western sense than Persian, which is specifically only one of the Indo-Aryan speaking groups, although the largest in what is today and Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran. The diversity, yes. All right, so Aryan is diverse. You have Persians and Kurds and Balukis. They're all Aryans. Only the Azeris, who are Turkic, and the Arabs, who are down in the south, and I guess the Armenians and Jews in places like Tehran would be non-Aryan. But yes, many of the people that had been under British colonial or semi-colonial rule were much more sympathetic to Germany and Italy than they were to the British, and for good reason. The fascists and the National Socialists were not stealing their resources and propping up bad, corrupt governments and doing other bad things in the Middle East for centuries, the way the British and the French had been doing. But of course, if you demonize the Nazis and the fascists as being nothing but irrationally evil, then you kind of miss the whole context, right? So you end up, well, why would these Arabs and Persians be pro-German? They must all be evil too, right? There's no rational reason why anybody opposed the great Churchill. All right, so let's see if anybody sent me. No DM, no email. Yeah, I'm not familiar with the Caspian Report. Azerbaijan is a state who's currently quite anti-Russian, anti-Armenian, which is Armenian allied with the Russians. That's their only friend other than Iran in a hostile Turkic surrounded environment. Azerbaijan also, in part because of the Azeri minority in Iran, hostile to the government in Tehran, and this has been the case since Azerbaijan was created, I guess, in 1918, and then it becomes part of the Soviet Union at the end of 1922 as a Soviet Socialist Republic. But there was a lot of Soviet propaganda out of Baku for decades about liberating what they called southern Azerbaijan from the Persians. All right. Now what we got here? I heard Duke gonna have a stream on Churchill tomorrow to counter some of the Churchill hate from Thomas 777. Okay, well, wow. Most on YouTube are suspect. Catherine was a little biased. Now it's amped up to 11. Yeah, well, I mean, again, Azerbaijan is one of those states that did not have a real strong ethnic identity of its own until quite recently. Pretty much only become nationally aware in the 20th century. So about a century later than Europe. But a lot of Azeri nationalism is like other nationalism based upon who you are not, who you hate. So the Azeris are currently, it's first and foremost, they're not Armenian. Second, they're not Russian. And third, they're not Persian. All right. I still haven't gotten anybody wants to come on, so maybe I'll wrap it up early. I'll read through the chat here. All right. I guess I'll leave this one up since it's nothing terribly offensive. Although obviously, furthermore, one of the things I had a problem with, so maybe perhaps this would be the last final kind of a methodological. The German formation of these units is very tangled. They keep splitting them off. As I said, for instance, Skanderberg, the Albanian Waffen SS unit, is split off from the Hanshar, the Bosnian Waffen SS unit. But there's lots of splitting off and recombination and restructuring of lots of these military units. So try and keep would require a fair amount of going over material to get all of it straight. But in the end, it's pretty much just non-important detail. I mean, the important point was that the German military used a lot of these people, and these people had legitimate reasons to support the Germans, given repression in the Soviet Union, but also that the current kind of idea of Nazi Germany being racist in the model of the Ku Klux Klan or other anti-black racism really doesn't fit. There's not a lot of black and brown people in Germany. They are concerned with removing first dysgenic elements of their own folk, but then the Jewish population and the Gypsy population, and finally, as they conquer land to the east, thinning the Slavic population. Well, I mean, a lot of it's ad hoc, yes. Germans didn't think they were going to capture millions of Soviet POWs, and then they didn't think they were going to get over 1.3 million volunteers out of those POW camps to go and fight against the Soviets. So, and in some sense, the people on the ground, I mean, obviously people like Otto Werber, who was later made in the officer in the Abwehr and commands the Kalmuk Cavalry Corps for the Wehrmacht, knew about the Kalmuks, but most of even the highly educated, highly intelligent German officers in the Heer, as they're advancing east, were not intimately familiar with the variety of different nationalnosti in the USSR. So, I mean, if they went through the Caucasus Mountains and there's a language changing every couple of miles, and sometimes radically from a Circassian to a Turkic language to a Vainak language. You have Ossetian, which is a Persian language in there. A lot of it, they were kind of surprised at what they were finding. I mean, it's not complete surprise in that there were some people who knew something, but so it's not like when the Spanish came into New Mexico and everything was like being on an alien planet. But for the most part, they had not planned out what they were going to do with the local populations. It was all ad hoc, and cobbled together. And there was also serious institutional squabbles between the SS and the Wehrmacht, the National Socialist Party itself, the Ostministerium. So you have people like Alfred Rosenberg, who want to support all of the non-Russians in some giant alliance against Moscow. And you have people like Erich Koch, who want to subjugate Ukraine. As Koch said, if I ever meet a Ukrainian worthy of sitting at the same table with me, I must have him shot. And then decreed that no Ukrainian should have more than an 8th grade education in the German Gau that he was administering in Western and Central Ukraine. So it's a lot of chaos here. I mean, so it's not like they had everything planned out and everybody agreed. And in some cases, it's worked to their advantage. Obviously, the kind of hands-off, you can do what you want as long as you don't oppose us. The strategy of the Wehrmacht in the Northern Caucasus was much more successful for the Germans than the repressive measures taken in Ukraine by Erich Koch and people around him. Also kind of propelled on by the Minister of Labor, Fritz Sokol, who wanted Ukrainian forced laborers sent to Germany to make up for the lack of manpower in industry due to mass military conscription. Yeah, but my whole point, the Germans did put a lot of thought into organizing it. You can see there are some Germans, Alfred Rosenberg, I think probably the most famous, that talk about who could be potentially allies with the Germans, and particularly, he talks about the Lithuanians, the Latvians, the Estonians, the Ukrainians against the Soviets. And there are some German officials, but they're not in powerful positions. All right, so obviously Rosenberg is not anywhere near the influential position that someone like Heinrich Himmler or Joseph Goebbels are, as far as convincing Der Fuhrer the correct path to take. So there's kind of an institutional fighting as to who gets the ear and who gets the time with to try and sell their strategy to Hitler himself. The people that were advocating for these types of like pan-European or even pan-Aryan, or which would include, say, Iran, or or just anti-allies, right? They're not. They were never in a winning position. Right? Rosenberg might have been the highest-ranking guy, and he just never got anywhere with the command, and in part for good reason. when the Romanians came into Ukraine, they sacked and robbed and looted all of the German settlements there in the Black Sea region. And given the ideology of Yaroslav Stetsko, who declared an independent Ukrainian state in 41 with Stefan Bandera, of having a purely Ukrainian Ukraine state when there's 400,000 Germans living there, the prudent thing for the Germans was to do what they did. They put Stetsko and Bandera in Sachsenhausen camp until 1943, when they were losing the war and needed Ukrainian soldiers to slow down the advance of the Red Army toward Germany. But I mean, obviously, this also goes to the complexity. It's not, again, black and white. Outside of the Jews and the Gypsies, there isn't any consensus among all of the National Socialist leaders as to the treatment and position and status of non-Germans. All right, so most of them agree that your Nordic Germans, your Norwegians, your Danes, who both came under German occupation, people in the lowlands, the Netherlands, Belgium, even people in France, more or less equal Europeans. But then what do you do with the Slavs? Obviously, some Slavic groups like the Poles and the Serbs treated very badly. Others, like the Croatians, various Cossacks, treated quite well. Slovakia made an ally as well as Croatia. So there isn't a kind of a coherent logic to National Socialist racial hierarchy other than Germans at the top and Jews and Gypsies at the bottom. Pretty much a lot of the peoples in the East, various Slavic groups, various Turkic groups, people who are neither, such as the Lithuanians, they're kind of, it's not real well thought out as to what to do with them. All right? Do you make them into full allies? Do you occupy and exploit them? Do you give them some sort of autonomy? These were things that they never really had thought out and never really resolved even on the battlefield. Yeah, right, because they're in the middle of a war, so, there isn't a consensus. The Wehrmacht breaks through into the North Caucasus, and there's never a civilian National Socialist Party government established there. So they basically say, what's best for the military is what we do here. Kind of hands off the local population. And then areas like Poland, where they dissolve, it's like, well, this will be a area for, recruitment of forced laborers and ghettoization of the Jewish population until a final solution can be executed, right? But you can see, and if you look at kind of broad general categories, Slovaks or Slavs, if they had an independent state under Monsignor Tiso, allied with the Germans. Poles are Slavs, yet their state was dissolved and the intellectuals executed, and many of them used for forced labor. The same thing basically with Ukraine early on. in 41 and 42. Serbia, another example. But then Croatia has basically an autonomous state run by Ante Pavelic and the Ha, allied with Germany and Italy. So the Croatians do quite well. So I mean, it's hit and miss here as to the practice of German treatment of non-Germans. Right. So basically, the Nordic peoples, Alpine peoples, even Latin peoples, southern France, given autonomy under the Vichy regime of Pétain, and Italy, an ally, are all treated pretty equally as fellow Europeans. But it's all a mess in the East as to which Slavic groups, as to the treatment of different Slavic groups. So it ranges from very poor for Poland to quite good for Croatia. All right. If nobody wants to come on, I'll probably log out. Well, I'm not sure if schizophrenic is the word, but yeah, they were scattered. They were not unified. They did not have a single implemented plan that the Wehrmacht, the Waffen SS, the National Socialist Party, the Ostministerium, and other institutions all agreed upon. I am in the same place I was last time, Neues Mexico. All right. Well, if Niaz is not going to come on and discuss the Indian National Army under Boza with me, then I'll probably wrap it up. I thought perhaps, given his connections to the Bengal region, and you might know something about Boza and the Indian National Army, supported by Germany and Japan against the British. But obviously, in 1941 to 1945, lots of people have legitimate reasons not to love Stalin, FDR, or Churchill, and perhaps had legitimate reason to throw their lot in with Hitler and Mussolini, including, as I mentioned, Iraq and Iran, who are invaded by the British in 1941 and occupied. Did not make them very happy about the British. All right, I will wrap it up then, because I've got to work tomorrow afternoon and night. But I'll leave this one up because I don't think it's anything terribly offensive. Although obviously not my most organized talk, in part because the creation of all these units is rather chaotic, as I mentioned. There's a lack of planning and organization, particularly on the Eastern Front, as the Germans advance and then retreat between 1941 and 1945. All right, so thanks everybody for coming on. Hit the like button. If you want to see me sweat less in the next video, you can contribute to my air conditioner fund down there, Patreon. Or if you like to see me sweat, I guess you won't contribute, but you can, if you haven't already, buy my book. If You can get it from Columbia University Press or Amazon. And I'll see everybody later.